It was supposed to be just another freezing night for Deputy Jack Reynolds and his loyal K9, Ranger. But destiny had other plans. Through the storm, a terrified little boy stumbled into the headlights, his arm broken, clutching a torn backpack like it held his only chance at life. And then he whispered words that shattered Jack's world. "Please, save me from my dad. He killed my mom." What Jack uncovered next wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a web of darkness, crime, and corruption that stretched far beyond anything he'd ever faced. This story will break your heart, shake your soul, and remind you that even in the coldest storms, hope still fights back. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The storm rolled over Ironwood, Montana, like a living thing, raking its claws across the mountains, swallowing the 2-lane road that cut through the pines, and sanding every surface with ice that glittered under the sodium street lamps. Ironwood was not a big place, not by any measure. It was a town of weathered storefronts with names painted by hand, a diner that still boiled coffee in steel pots, a hardware store that smelled of rope and oil, and a courthouse that looked older than the trees themselves. In winter, the town hunkered down, wood smoke threading from chimneys, porch lights burning late as if a small bulb could push back a hungry night. The wind came down from the high ridges and slapped the valley flat, and the snow, thick, dry, and needling, moved in long gray veils that blurred distance into a rumor. On nights like this, tires hummed low and careful, and even the bravest hunters kept their trucks in the drive. But the county cruiser moved, steady and measured, a warm square of light gliding through whiteout. Behind the wheel sat Deputy Jack Reynolds. 38. The years had leaned him into broad-shouldered solidity, the kind a person trusted in a crisis. He kept his hair short out of habit, and wore the faint shadow of a beard that never quite took over his square jaw. When he did let it grow, there was more ash than he remembered. The Marines had given him the posture, back straight, eyes always scanning, and the scars no one saw. 2 tours had carved steady into his bones and sanded down his patience for cruelty. In Ironwood, folks would say he was polite in the way men are, who could be dangerous if the day called for it. He spoke little, listened much. These nights belonged to him and the road and the partner who breathed quietly beside him. Ranger lay in the back, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a broad chest and the kind of thick winter coat that drank the cold like it was nothing. His head was blocky, ears like sentries, muzzle peppered with early grays that made him look wiser than his years. The department called him K9, but Jack, in the privacy of the cruiser and the long, dark stretches between mile markers, called him "Hey, buddy," and "Good boy," and sometimes nothing at all, just reached a hand back at red lights to feel the press of a warm nose. Ranger's temperament split the difference between soldier and saint. He could lock onto a scent with ruthless focus, but around children he moved like water, soft, patient, present. The trainer said Ranger was a once-in-a-decade dog, the kind you remember even when your badge is in a drawer and the ghosts outnumber the holidays. Jack believed it. The radio mumbled and hissed in the center console, wind interfering with the scattered repeaters that tried, against the geography, to stitch the county together. Dispatch had nothing urgent. A fallen branch on County Road 9. A pickup sliding into a ditch near Elk Spur that a cousin already promised to yank out with a chain. The heater coughed, and Jack adjusted the defroster, watching the wipers carve crescents in the frost, then leaned forward to peer into the curled world beyond the hood. "Quiet, huh?" he said, voice easy, as if the dog might answer in English. Ranger thumped his tail once against the vinyl, Jack's hands looked big on the wheel. The knuckles were pale, the fingers thick from years of grip. Rifle, tool handle, steering. Things that didn't lie. He wore the department's winter jacket, navy and reflective in all the right places, collar up to guard the exposed skin. The badge on his chest caught the stray dashboard glow and made a small sun in a car built to push through midnight. He passed the turnoff to the sawmill, just a dim shape with a fence scrolled in snow, and descended toward a low stretch where the road crossed a creek by a concrete culvert. Everything narrowed there. The trees leaned in, the banks rose up, and the night gathered itself like a spring. Jack's eyes moved left, right, center with the steady metronome of long practice. The first sign wasn't a shape, but a sound. A soft stutter of breath that didn't belong to engine or wind. Ranger's head came up, ears pricked, body tightening to a single quiet line. Jack's boot eased the brake, not hard, just enough to lean the cruiser off speed and give his attention a wider frame to live inside. The headlights reached forward and found a figure where there shouldn't be one. It wasn't big. It lurched from the shoulder into the lane like a bird knocked from a wire, caught itself, then reeled a few steps into the beams. For a heartbeat, the snow was a curtain, a theater trick, and then the night opened, and there he was. A boy, 8 years old, if a person knew children, and Jack did, not by parenting but by 100 calls that had taught him the height of fear at different ages. The boy wore a red puffer jacket that had patched elbows and a missing snap at the collar. The zipper had broken, and someone had tied rough twine across his chest to keep it closed. A knit cap had been pulled down to his eyebrows and then pushed up again in panic, leaving his blonde hair matted with packed crystals that caught the light and turned his head into a crown of ice. He held his left arm close to his body, hand disappearing into the right sleeve like a sparrow hiding its wing. The angle was wrong. Jack's eyes catalogued it in an instant, the kind of wrong that radiated pain into a face until it smoothed everything else away. He carried a backpack, pink once, now washed out and scuffed, a stitched unicorn fraying at the edges, and he clutched it with the desperation of a life jacket. Jack braked to a full stop, swung the cruiser to block the lane, hazard lights popping amber into the storm. He killed the siren he hadn't turned on, and threw the gear into park. "Ranger, stay," he said, not because the dog would rush, but because words laid down rails for moments like this. He stepped out, cold biting any skin bold enough to be bare, one hand lifted so he looked smaller, the other at his radio but not raised to his shoulder. "Hey," Jack said, voice finding that low place adults use when the world has cut a child open and you need your words to be a tourniquet. "Hey there, buddy. You're all right. I'm Jack." The boy looked up, and the terror in him was bright and alive, not the wide-eyed kind you see in a kid who fell off a bike, but the old terror that knows the shape of hands and nights and what happens when the door shuts. His eyes were blue in a way that hurt under the LEDs, red-rimmed, lashes clotted with the storm. His mouth worked once, twice, and then the words came out as if he had rehearsed them in the dark, standing on a bed with a backpack already on his shoulders. "Please," he said, and his voice broke on the first syllable, then steadied like a soldier. "Please, save me from my dad." Jack stopped in the space between steps, the kind of freeze that has nothing to do with temperature. Something old turned in him, a hinge he thought had rusted shut. He kept his hands where the boy could see them, open and human and empty. "Okay," he said. "Okay, we can do that. What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy said. "Ethan Carter." The last name hit like a thrown stone. Carter, a sound that moved through the county like a rumor, attached to businesses that had money that came from places no one could point to on a map. Jack filed it where he filed things that mattered. "Ethan," he said, using the name because names are bridges. "I'm going to get you warm. My partner's in the car. He's a good dog. He's here to help. Can I come closer?" The boy nodded. A small, stiff movement, the kind pain allows. His breath smoked in short, hard bursts that said the cold had a hand around his ribs. Jack closed the distance slowly, angled so he could wrap the cruiser behind the kid and deflect the wind. Up close, he saw the sling. The right sleeve tied off at the wrist. The left arm slid through, the elbow cradled against the belly to take weight off a fracture. The cloth had dark stains that didn't look like melted snow. "Your arm?" Jack asked softly. "Hurts," Ethan said. He said it like a fact, a person, and the weather had agreed on. Jack knelt so his eyes were level with the boy's. His own knees registered cold through the uniform, but he didn't stand. "We'll take care of it at the station," he said. "I promise." Ethan swallowed, then leaned forward so only Jack could hear the rest, as if the storm had ears. "He killed my mom." The sentence didn't wobble. It fell between them like a weight that bent the night. Ranger gave a low sound from the back of the cruiser, a noise he made when something in the air changed shape, and Jack felt it in his chest. War, crime, and darkness. Those were words for people who needed labels to keep the world orderly. Jack had spent years with labels and knew how often they failed. There were only two categories that mattered: harm and what you did about it. He didn't look away from Ethan. "Okay," he said, and the word was a vow. "You're not going back there." He glanced at the backpack. "Can I carry that for you?" Ethan flinched, then hugged it tighter, a reflex that told a whole story in one motion. "It has stuff," he said. "From Mom." Jack nodded once, slow. "Then you hold it," he said. "I'll get the door." He stood and opened the rear passenger side. Ranger scooted to make space, pressing his shoulder against the seat as if he understood that companionship had weight and warmth. Jack offered an arm, and Ethan climbed in with the careful, practiced movements of a kid who had been hurting long enough to learn economy. Ranger lowered his head until his muzzle rested near Ethan's knee, eyes soft, pupils wide, ears set to an angle that said, "I am here without the arrogance of a guard." The boy's fingers, trembling, found thick fur and stayed there. In the small cabin of the cruiser, the cold receded a fraction, not because the heater was great, it wasn't, but because breath, fur, and the ordinary miracle of proximity made a weather of their own. Jack rounded the hood, slid back behind the wheel, and eased the cruiser into motion. The tires found their line again, and the snow turned back into a river they could cross. He kept one eye on the mirrors, the other tracing the dim world ahead. He didn't touch the radio. Not yet. People like Victor Carter had ways of hearing things they shouldn't, and until Jack understood the exact shape of tonight, the circle would stay small. A man, a boy, a dog, and a promise. The wipers beat time, the heater hummed. Ethan's breathing began to stretch from staccato to something closer to normal. He rested the backpack on his thighs like a book he didn't want anyone to read over his shoulder. Jack spoke into the quiet, without crowding it. "Ranger's 5, he said, as if he were telling the weather the storm would end. "He likes tennis balls, salmon jerky, and pretending he doesn't understand bath time." A small sound came from the back, a funny, wet hiccup exhale that might have been the shadow of a laugh. Ethan leaned into Ranger a little more. Jack drove past the turnoff for the Carter property without looking toward it, but he felt the gravity of it like a mountain in fog. The county had seen money show up at odd hours, Papers filed by lawyers who didn't live here. A barn no one used. Lights on at times when nothing legitimate needed light. People made choices. Some chose to leave questions alone. Jack had never been good at that. He reminded himself, the mission had an order. First, the boy. Then, the truth. The road lifted toward town, the snow thickened, and the world narrowed until Ironwood appeared all at once. Gas station canopy, diner, sign swinging on a chain, courthouse steps glazed white, and the substation, a squat building that pretended it wasn't tired. Jack turned in. The gravel under ice made a sound like someone chewing on glass. He parked under the eave, left the engine running, and twisted in his seat. "Ethan," he said, "we're here. Warm inside. Cocoa if you want, a blanket. We'll look at your arm and make a plan." Ethan nodded, the sort of nod that meant he was borrowing belief from the man in the front seat, because his own was in short supply. Jack stepped out, opened the rear door, and offered his good hand again. Ethan slid out carefully, boots squeaking, backpack clutched. Ranger followed, stepping into the wind like a wall that moved with the boy. For a second, under the eave's low light, Jack saw the three of them as if from a distance. A man who had seen too much and wasn't finished seeing. A dog who would die for a command he trusted. And a child whose life had been yanked sideways but who'd found the one place tonight where the floor wouldn't give. Jack keyed the door, ushered them inside, and let the lock thunk home behind them. The station smelled like coffee gone old, and disinfectant and wet wool, the sense of a place that held nights. He shrugged out of his coat, hung it on the rack, and guided Ethan into his office. A room of banged-up desk, a map with thumbtacks, a corkboard that pretended not to have secrets. He grabbed the brown blanket he kept for winter strays and draped it over the boy's shoulders. The fabric swallowed him in a way that made him look smaller before it made him look safe. Jack crouched again, level with Ethan's eyes. "You did the right thing," he said. "You did the brave thing." Ethan blinked hard, then found Ranger's ear with his fingers, and held on. The dog leaned into the touch, breathing slow and deep, making a steady drum of calm that filled the room under the hum of fluorescence. Outside, the wind clawed the siding, and the storm shoved its face against the glass, but inside a line had been drawn and stepped across. The patrol had been just another cold night until it wasn't. And now, because a boy stepped into the headlights and asked to be saved, the shape of what came next had changed. Quietly. Utterly. Jack felt the click of it in his chest, a promise seating into place like a round in a chamber. The ordinary had ended at the culvert. The fight had begun. The wind screamed against the walls of the Ironwood Sheriff's substation as if it were trying to pry its way inside. The storm hadn't eased since Deputy Jack Reynolds had brought Ethan Carter in, and the windows were now frosted over with jagged sheets of ice. Inside, the small building hummed with the low buzz of heating vents and the smell of burnt coffee lingering from hours ago. Ranger, the 5-year-old German shepherd, sat at attention near the office door, his amber eyes never straying far from Ethan. The boy had settled into the worn leather chair across from Jack's desk, a brown wool blanket draped around his shoulders like a shield. The fluorescent lights above them flickered occasionally, bathing the room in a sterile glow that made the bruises on Ethan's small face look darker and more pronounced. Jack watched him carefully, speaking little. He had learned long ago, both from interrogations and from comforting victims, that silence often opened doors faster than questions. Ethan's backpack sat on the desk between them. It was torn and faded, a pink unicorn stitched on the front nearly rubbed away. The boy clutched it tightly with both hands, as though letting go might undo the fragile sense of safety that was only just beginning to settle over him. Ethan, Jack said gently, his voice measured and steady. I need to understand what's going on so I can protect you. Can you show me what's inside your bag? The boy hesitated, biting his lip. His blue eyes, too old for 8 years, darted to Ranger before returning to Jack. Slowly, he unzipped the backpack. The sound was loud in the quiet room, like a zipper cutting through the storm itself. The first thing he pulled out was a kitchen knife, wrapped in an old dish towel. Rust-colored stains crusted the blade. Jack's stomach clenched. He had seen death many times, but evidence like this, in the hands of a child, carried a weight that was harder to stomach. This is what he used, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. He used it on my mom. Jack nodded slowly, forcing his expression to remain neutral. You were very brave to bring this with you, he said. It can help us stop him. Next came a small black USB drive shaped like a star. Ethan held it with surprising care, his tiny fingers gripping it like something sacred. Mom gave me this, he said. She said it had the truth inside. She told me if something ever happened to her, I had to run and find someone who could fight monsters. Jack's jaw tightened. Monsters was a word he had heard before, from soldiers, from survivors, from people who had seen the worst of humanity. And it was never used lightly. The final item in the bag was a stack of photographs held together by a rubber band. Ethan placed them on the desk one by one. The first showed a woman, his mother, Laura Carter, with dark bruises blooming across her arms. The second revealed a split lip and a swollen cheek. By the third, Jack had to close his eyes for a moment. Each photo told a story of cruelty, repeated, escalating, and unchecked. She told me to take pictures, Ethan said quietly. She said no one would believe her without proof. Jack leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. This wasn't just domestic violence. It was evidence of something far larger. The knife, the USB, the photographs. They painted a picture of a man capable of anything. And that man was Victor Carter. Victor Carter's name wasn't new to Jack. 42 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, and a smile that never reached his cold, slate-gray eyes. In public, he was the picture of respectability, a successful businessman who owned several construction companies across Montana. But Jack knew better. Victor's name had come up in whispers before, laundering money through real estate deals, running escort services that were fronts for trafficking rings, making people disappear when they got too close. Nothing had ever stuck. Too many witnesses recanted. Too many pieces of evidence vanished. Too many people were too afraid. Jack exhaled slowly. Ethan, he said, leaning forward, I need you to tell me about your father. Everything you know, everything you've seen. The boy swallowed hard, his small hands trembling in his lap. He makes women go with men for money, Ethan began, his voice barely above a whisper. He tells them if they don't, he'll hurt them or send them away. Men come to the house, men with cars and guns. They give him money and they laugh. Mom said it was dirty money. Jack's gut twisted. This was confirmation of everything he'd suspected but never been able to prove. Did your mom ever talk about leaving? He asked. She tried, Ethan said, tears pooling in his eyes. But he said if she left, he'd find her. He said no one could stop him. And then, one night, he hit her with a bottle. There was so much blood. He told me she was sleeping, but I knew. The boy's voice broke. Ranger, sensing the shift, padded closer and rested his head gently on Ethan's knee. The boy's fingers sank into the dog's fur, grounding himself in the warmth and presence. Jack didn't move for a long time. His training told him to radio in immediately, to start the paperwork, to put this evidence into the system. But another part of him, older and more instinctive, whispered caution. If Victor Carter was half as connected as Jack suspected, one wrong move could alert him, and that would put Ethan in even greater danger. A sharp knock broke the tension. Jack's hand instinctively drifted toward his holster before he caught himself. Standing in the doorway was Deputy Susan Keller, a colleague and one of the few people Jack trusted without reservation. Susan was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, with a runner's build and a sharp, analytical gaze. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, and a faint scar traced along her jawline, a souvenir from a domestic call that had gone sideways years ago. She had a reputation for patience and empathy, but beneath that was a steel resolve that criminals underestimated at their peril. "Everything all right in here?" she asked, eyes flicking from Ethan to the evidence spread across the desk. "Yeah," Jack replied, "but we've got something big. Real big." Susan stepped in, her eyes widening as she took in the photographs and the USB. "Is that—" "It's exactly what you think it is," Jack said grimly. "And more." Susan's expression hardened. "Victor Carter." Jack nodded. "The boy says he killed his mother. And this," he gestured to the USB, "might be the smoking gun we've been waiting for." Susan glanced at Ethan, her expression softening. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she said gently. "We're going to make sure he never hurts anyone again." Ethan looked up at her, his lip trembling. "Promise?" "I promise," she said. Jack met Susan's gaze, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. They couldn't trust everyone, not with this. They'd have to move carefully, quietly, and deliberately. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was coming. He turned back to Ethan. "You did the right thing by running," he said, "and now we're going to do the right thing too. We're going to stop him." The boy nodded, his fingers still tangled in Ranger's fur. For the first time since stepping into the headlights, there was something in his eyes other than fear. It was faint, fragile, but unmistakable. Hope. And Jack Reynolds, Marine-turned-deputy, vowed silently to himself. He would burn Victor Carter's empire to the ground before he let that hope die. The storm finally broke by morning, leaving Ironwood draped in a deceptive calm. The streets were buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, the pine branches bowed low, and the sky stretched pale and brittle like frost on glass. But Jack Reynolds knew better than to trust the silence. Storms like this didn't end, they just changed shape. Inside the sheriff's substation, the evidence from Ethan's torn backpack was now sealed in an evidence locker, knife, USB, and photographs, labeled and logged. But Jack's mind wasn't on paperwork. His eyes stayed fixed on the faint tire tracks outside, the ones he had noticed hours before near the road where Ethan had stumbled out of the night. Those tracks were their only thread to Victor Carter's shadow world, and threads, Jack knew, were meant to be pulled. "Ranger, gear up," Jack muttered, pulling his heavy winter coat over his uniform. The German shepherd rose instantly from his spot beside Ethan's chair, tail swishing once, muscles tense with purpose. Ranger had been unusually watchful all morning, pacing near the door and sniffing the air as if the wind itself carried the scent of danger. Jack glanced back toward Ethan, who sat curled up with a cup of cocoa, the blanket still around his shoulders. Susan Keller had stayed behind to watch him, her sharp brown eyes scanning the room with the vigilance of someone who knew how quickly predators could return to claim what they thought was theirs. "You sure about this?" Susan asked. "If Victor's people are out there, you could be walking straight into a trap." Jack tightened the strap on his utility belt. "If they are, that means we're close, and I don't intend to let them vanish before we find where they're hiding the rest of those women." Susan sighed, but nodded. "I'll keep Ethan safe. Just don't go cowboy on me." "Wouldn't dream of it," Jack replied with a faint smirk. though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The snow crunched under his boots as he stepped outside, Ranger padding silently beside him. The tire marks were half buried now, softened by wind, but they still cut a faint trail leading out of town and into the dense northern woods. Jack crouched and traced a gloved hand along the compressed snow. Heavy vehicle, van or SUV, likely carrying weight. That could mean cargo or victims. Either way, he couldn't ignore it. They followed the trail for over an hour, the forest swallowing them whole. Tall spruces loomed like watchmen, their branches bending under snow. The world was soundless except for the crunch of boots and Ranger's steady panting. Every so often Jack scanned the tree line, hand resting on his sidearm. Years in the Marines had drilled caution into his bones. Never walk into a place you haven't already planned your way out of. Eventually, the tracks veered off the main road onto a narrow logging path, barely visible beneath the snow. Jack slowed, eyes narrowing. The deeper they went, the more the forest felt wrong. Abandoned soda cans half buried in drifts, cigarette butts crushed into the ice, and then, just ahead, a faint metallic glint through the trees. It was a shack, if you could call it that. A squat, weather-beaten structure leaning against the slope of a hill, its roof patched with sheets of rusted tin. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, but footprints, several sets, circled the door, some recent enough that snow hadn't yet erased their shape. Jack signaled Ranger to stay low. The dog crouched instantly, ears forward, tail still. "Showtime," Jack whispered. He approached slowly, weapon drawn, each step measured. The door's padlock hung broken, its chain dangling like a snapped bone. Jack nudged it open with the muzzle of his Glock, and a gust of stale, sour air hit him like a fist. The smell was unmistakable. Fear, sweat, decay, and gasoline. The shack's single room was dimly lit by thin shafts of light slipping through gaps in the boards. Against one wall stood a row of rusted, metal-framed beds, stained mattresses still shackled with steel cuffs. A metal bucket lay overturned in the corner, flies buzzing lazily around it despite the cold. But it was the floor that stopped him cold. Scraps of torn women's clothing scattered across the boards. A single ballet flat without its pair. A blood-stained scarf. A child's stuffed bear missing an ear. Each artifact was a story cut short, a life stripped of dignity. "Jesus," Jack muttered under his breath. Ranger sniffed the ground, hackles raised, and then barked sharply, an alert. Jack followed the sound and froze. Faint smears of dried blood streaked one wall, trailing down toward the floor. There were handprints, too. Small, desperate crescents carved into the wood where someone had tried to claw their way free. And then he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it. A ragged cough. Movement. He swung the flashlight towards the corner and saw a figure slumped beside the cold iron stove. She was alive. The woman was in her early 30s, though the years had carved deeper lines into her face than her age deserved. She was painfully thin, her frame shaking beneath a tattered sweatshirt and threadbare leggings. Her dark hair was hacked short and uneven, as if someone had cut it with dull scissors. Bruises painted her pale skin, and her eyes, wide, brown, and glassy, flicked between fear and disbelief. Jack holstered his weapon and crouched, his voice low and careful. "Ma'am, my name is Deputy Reynolds. You're safe now." The woman blinked, lips trembling as she tried to speak. He left us here. Said he'd come back for the others. I tried to run when I heard the car leave, but I couldn't get far." "What's your name?" Jack asked. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Jennings." "Can you stand, Clara?" She shook her head weakly. I don't think so. Jack offered her a canteen from his belt. Clara's hands shook as she drank, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks. I'm from Spokane, she said, her voice breaking. He promised me a job. And then there was no way out. Jack's jaw tightened. How many others? 3, Clara said. He took them 2 nights ago, said they had to work, said... Her words dissolved into sobs. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're not going back. Not now, not ever. With Ranger circling the room and scanning for movement, Jack helped Clara to her feet, supporting her weight with one arm. Every step she took seemed to cost her everything, but she didn't stop. Together they stepped out into the cold daylight, leaving behind the stench of pain. On the trek back to the cruiser, Clara spoke in broken fragments about how Victor's men patrolled the woods with rifles, how the women were moved between locations, how money was funneled through fake businesses in 3 different states. Jack listened, committing every detail to memory. This wasn't just one cabin. This was one node in a network, a machine designed to consume lives and spit out profit. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains. Clara sagged into the passenger seat of the cruiser, wrapped in Ranger's spare blanket. She stared out the window, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. You saved me, she whispered. I didn't think anyone would come. Jack started the engine. We're just getting started. As they rolled back toward Ironwood, Jack's mind churned. The shack was confirmation. Victor's operation wasn't just rumor anymore. And if Clara was telling the truth, the real center of it all wasn't in the woods. It was somewhere else, somewhere bigger. The van that had brought the women here had headed east before turning south. That path led to only one place, the warehouse by the river. The same warehouse whispered about in old case files and anonymous tips. The same place Jack had never been able to tie directly to Carter, until now. He glanced at Ranger in the rearview mirror. The dog's eyes met his, steady and resolute. We're going to burn it down, Jack said under his breath. Ranger huffed softly, as if in agreement. The sun sank lower, staining the snow in long, amber streaks. The road back into town was silent. But inside the cruiser, something had shifted. This was no longer about saving one boy or even one woman. It was about dismantling a monster's empire, brick by brick. And Jack Reynolds had just found the first crack in the wall. The night had settled over Ironwood like a heavy shroud, the cold deeper and sharper than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into bone and made even the bravest men glance over their shoulders. The town was nearly silent. Snowdrifts piled against shuttered storefronts, and the occasional gust rattled street signs that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. Inside the sheriff's substation, the light of a single desk lamp cast long, thin shadows across case files and crime scene photos, painting the room in gold and gray. Jack Reynolds sat at his desk, the faint aroma of burnt coffee clinging to the air. Across the room, Clara Jennings slept uneasily on a cot, her gaunt frame twitching as if her nightmares refused to let her rest. Ethan had curled up on the worn leather couch, his small frame wrapped in a thick blanket. His breathing was shallow, but steady. Beside him, Ranger lay like a sentry, head on his paws, ears flicking at every sound. Jack hadn't slept. His mind was still caught in the shack deep in the forest, the blood-stained walls, the handcuffs bolted to bed frames, the haunted look in Clara's eyes. Victor Carter's empire wasn't a theory anymore. It was a living, breathing machine built on suffering. And Jack knew that once Victor realized his operation had been discovered, he wouldn't sit idle. He'd strike back. It was only a matter of when. That when came at 2:14 a.m. Ranger was the first to sense it. The dog's head shot up, muscles tightening, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Jack looked up from the report he'd been writing, his instincts instantly on edge. "What is it, boy?" Before Ranger could respond, the first window shattered inward with an ear-splitting crack, shards exploding across the room. A heartbeat later, a second blast followed, bullets chewing into the wood-paneled walls, splintering a filing cabinet into shrapnel. "Down!" Jack shouted. He dove behind his desk, dragging Ethan with him. Clara jolted awake, eyes wide with terror, as Ranger barked furiously, his deep, thunderous growl filling the room. The front door burst open, snow swirling in from the streetlight beyond, and 3 men stormed in with weapons raised. The first was a hulking man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered with a thick black beard streaked with gray. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jawline, a souvenir from a bar fight years ago. His name, Jack would learn later, was Ray Delgado, a career enforcer with a reputation for violence and zero hesitation when it came to following orders. He carried a pump-action shotgun and moved like a man who'd broken bones before breakfast. Behind him was a wiry, sharp-eyed man in his late 20s, his shaved head covered by a knit cap. Mick Hanrahan had grown up bouncing between foster homes, his loyalty earned only by those who paid well. He clutched a pistol, his fingers twitching as if itching to use it. The third was Jonas Pike, nearing 40, with a long, nervous face and jittery movements that screamed paranoia. A former mechanic who'd fallen into debt, Jonas now served as Victor's errand boy, and his desperation showed in the way his hands trembled around the crowbar in one hand and a revolver in the other. "Find the kid!" Ray barked, his voice booming. But Ranger was already in motion. The German shepherd launched from behind the desk like a coiled spring, slamming into Jonas with a snarl. The revolver clattered across the floor as the dog's jaws clamped down on the man's forearm. Jonas screamed, thrashing helplessly. Jack used the chaos to his advantage, popping up from cover and firing a controlled burst from his service weapon. The shot hit Mick square in the shoulder, spinning him backward into the wall. His pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as he collapsed. Ray swung the shotgun toward Jack, but Jack dove to the side just as pellets ripped through the wooden desk. "Stay down, Ethan!" he yelled, rolling behind a file cabinet. His heart was pounding, but his training had taken over. Marine discipline never truly left you. Jack grabbed the fallen pistol near Mick's limp hand and, with a single swift move, kicked Ray's legs out from under him. The bigger man crashed to the ground, the shotgun skidding out of reach. "Don't move," Jack barked, pressing the pistol barrel against Ray's temple. Ray snarled, teeth bared like a cornered wolf, but he froze. Jonas continued screaming as Ranger held him pinned, the dog's growl vibrating through the floor. "Get off me, you bastard," Jonas spat. "Not a chance," Jack muttered. He kicked the shotgun farther away and cuffed Ray's wrists behind his back in one smooth motion. Mick lay slumped near the wall, groaning as blood seeped between his fingers. Jack disarmed him and dragged him closer to the others, then turned his attention to Jonas, whose face had gone pale from pain and fear. "Call him off," Jonas begged. "Not until you talk," Jack said coldly. "Why are you here? Why now?" Ray coughed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You already know why. Victor wants what's his. That USB, the photos, the kid, he'll burn this whole damn town to the ground if he has to." Jack's jaw tightened. "And he sent you to do his dirty work?" "We're just the beginning," Ray sneered. Jack slammed a fist into his gut, folding him in half. "Warehouse by the river," Ray wheezed. "That's where he runs things, but you'll never touch him." Jack bound the man's legs and dragged Jonas into a holding cell, still under Ranger's watchful glare. The station was a wreck. Glass littered the floor, bullet holes pocked the walls, and the acrid tang of gunpowder hung in the air. But Ethan was alive. Clara was safe. And the 3 men who had tried to tear that away from them were now in cuffs. Ethan crawled out from behind the desk, his small face pale but determined. Are they gone?" "For now," Jack said, crouching beside him. "But listen to me, Ethan, this isn't over. They'll keep coming." The boy's eyes welled with tears, but he nodded. "I don't care. I trust you." It was a simple sentence, but it hit Jack harder than any punch he'd ever taken. Trust. The kind of trust that came from someone who had lost everything and still dared to believe. Jack placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I promise." Ranger patted over, licking the boy's cheek as if sealing the vow. Ethan laughed through his tears, the sound fragile but real. Clara, still trembling, stepped closer, her voice hoarse. "He's got people everywhere, Jack. If he knows the USB's in your hands, he'll come with more than just 3 thugs next time." "I know," Jack said, glancing toward the evidence locker. "That's why we're going to end this. Not here, not in my station, at that warehouse." Ray, still cuffed and slumped against the wall, let out a ragged chuckle. "You think you can stop him? You're one man." Jack's eyes hardened. "One man, one dog, and the truth. Sometimes that's all it takes." The wind howled outside, rattling the broken window frames, but inside the substation, a different kind of storm was brewing. Victor Carter had declared war, and Jack Reynolds had just accepted. The storm over Ironwood had worsened by the time dawn's pale light bled across the horizon. Snow swirled in relentless sheets, blanketing the roads and muffling the world into an eerie silence. Inside the sheriff's substation, the aftermath of the attack was still raw. Boarded-up windows, shattered furniture, and the faint metallic scent of dried blood lingering in the air. Jack Reynolds hadn't slept. He sat at his desk, eyes locked on a city map spread across the surface, with red pins marking known safe houses, transport routes, and the location that mattered most now, the warehouse by the river. It wasn't just a storage point. According to Ray Delgado's interrogation, it was Victor Carter's operational heart, the place where money was laundered, documents were stored, and human lives were traded like currency. Jack knew this was where the fight had to go next. And it had to happen now, before Victor realized how much evidence was already in their hands. Ranger stirred beside him, the 5-year-old German shepherd's ears twitching in anticipation. The dog had been bred for service, strong frame, lean muscles, and deep amber eyes that seemed to read danger before it arrived. Over the years, he had become more than a partner. He was Jack's second heartbeat, his silent protector. Jack crouched, resting a hand on the dog's thick fur. "This is it, boy. We end it tonight." Ranger gave a quiet, determined bark as if he understood. Before leaving, Jack checked on Ethan, who had spent the night curled on the office couch, refusing to let go of the stuffed bear Clara had found for him. The boy's cheeks were pale, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but there was a growing steel beneath the fear now. "Are you going after him?" Ethan asked quietly. Jack nodded. "I am, and I need you to stay here with Clara. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me." Ethan swallowed hard. "Promise you'll come back." Jack crouched until they were eye level. "I promise. I'm not done fighting for you." The drive to the warehouse was a tense, silent journey through snow-choked roads and empty industrial streets. Ironwood's riverfront was a forgotten stretch of land, lined with rusted cranes, skeletal warehouses, and abandoned loading docks, an ideal place for a man like Victor to hide in plain sight. Jack parked several blocks away and continued on foot, Ranger moving beside him with silent precision. The wind cut like a blade against his cheeks, but Jack's pulse remained steady. He'd fought in far worse conditions overseas. He'd faced men more dangerous than Victor Carter, but none of them had ever taken something this personal. The warehouse loomed ahead like a steel fortress. 3 stories tall, its corrugated walls scarred with decades of neglect. A flickering floodlight illuminated the loading bay, where 2 trucks idled, their exhaust curling into the freezing air. Jack slipped through a side entrance. Service. Weapon drawn, every sense sharpened. Inside, the air smelled of oil, sweat, and something darker. Fear. Wooden crates stacked to the ceiling bore false shipping labels. Men with rifles paced the aisles, checking manifests and barking orders. At the center of the chaos stood Victor Carter. Victor was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair slicked back from a face carved in arrogance. His tailored wool coat, though out of place in the industrial setting, exuded wealth and control. His eyes, cold, calculating blue, scanned the warehouse like a king surveying his empire. He was a man who had built his fortune on pain, and his confidence carried the weight of someone who believed himself untouchable. Once a legitimate businessman, Victor had turned to crime after a devastating financial collapse a decade earlier, an event that hardened him, teaching him to view people not as lives, but as assets. Jack's pulse surged with anger. This was the man who had shattered Ethan's life, the man who had killed Laura Carter and believed he would never face justice. Moving through the shadows, Jack and Ranger cleared the perimeter. Ranger's keen nose led them to a partitioned room in the back. Behind a plywood wall, 3 women huddled together on a filthy mattress, their faces gaunt, their clothes torn. One, barely 20, whispered, "Please, help us." Jack's jaw tightened. "I will. Stay quiet and wait here." He handed them a small folding knife to cut their restraints before slipping back into the main floor. The element of surprise didn't last. A guard spotted Ranger's movement and shouted, "Intruder!" Chaos exploded. Gunfire tore through the air as Jack dove behind a crate, returning controlled bursts that dropped 2 men in seconds. Ranger leapt at another, clamping his jaws on the man's arm until his pistol clattered across the floor. The remaining guards scattered, shouting orders, but Jack was relentless. He advanced through the storm of bullets, moving with the calculated precision of a man who had lived through combat zones. Victor's voice roared over the gunfire. "Kill him! Don't let him touch the shipment!" But it was too late. One by one, Victor's men fell, and the 2 trucks were disabled before they could escape. Crates cracked open under the hail of bullets, spilling bundles of cash, forged passports, and ledgers filled with coded transactions. This wasn't just evidence, it was the skeleton of Victor's empire laid bare. Then, as the echoes of gunfire faded, silence fell. Jack stepped forward, weapon raised, scanning for Victor. But the man was gone. A faint sound, a muffled cry, pulled his attention to the far side of the warehouse, and then his blood turned to ice. Victor emerged from the shadows, a pistol pressed against Ethan's temple. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his face streaked with tears. Jack's heart sank. Somewhere between the chaos and the raid, Victor's men had breached the substation, overpowered Clara, and taken Ethan. Now the child was a hostage, his life hanging by the slightest twitch of Victor's finger. "You think you can walk into my world and tear it apart?" Victor snarled, dragging Ethan closer. "You forgot one thing. I still own him." Jack's grip on his weapon tightened. "Let him go, Victor. This isn't between you and him." Victor's laugh was cold and sharp. "A child? You really believe he's mine? Laura lied. She betrayed me. And now she's dead because of it." He yanked Ethan closer, making him cry out. "This boy isn't my blood. He's nothing." Something inside Ethan broke. His small voice rose, trembling but fierce. "You're not my dad! You killed my mom! You're nothing!" Victor's face twisted in rage, the barrel of his gun rising. "Ungrateful little—" That was all Jack needed. He gave a barely perceptible hand signal. Ranger exploded from the darkness, a blur of muscle and fury. The dog slammed into Victor's side, teeth sinking into his forearm. The pistol clattered to the floor as Victor roared in pain. Ethan stumbled free, and Jack surged forward, pulling him behind cover. "Stay down," he ordered, shielding the boy with his body. Victor thrashed on the ground, blood smearing the concrete as Ranger held fast. Jack stepped forward, service weapon leveled. "It's over, don't move." Victor spat blood and hatred. "You think this ends me? I have men in every city." Jack shoved him onto his stomach and snapped the handcuffs around his wrists. "Maybe, but it ends here tonight." The warehouse was a ruin. Cash scattered, records exposed, and Victor Carter face down in his own empire. Ethan clung to Ranger, tears streaming down his cheeks, but his voice was steady. "I'm not scared anymore." Jack knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to be. Not ever again." Outside, the sound of approaching sirens filled the night. Red and blue lights reflected off the icy river as state police units closed in. For the first time in years, Victor Carter wasn't the hunter. He was the prey. The flashing lights of police cruisers cast streaks of red and blue against the steel walls of the warehouse, their sirens howling through the frozen night. Snow still drifted lazily from the sky, swirling in the bitter wind as if mocking the chaos that had just unfolded inside. Victor Carter lay face down on the cold concrete, his wrists bound tightly behind his back, his expensive wool coat torn and soaked with blood from Ranger's bite. Around him, years of criminal empire lay in ruins, bundles of laundered cash scattered across the floor, ledgers filled with incriminating details, and terrified victims huddled together under the watch of state troopers. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut and radios crackling filled the cavernous space, but amid all the noise, one sound rose above it all: Ethan Carter's soft, uneven sobs. Jack Reynolds knelt beside the boy, wrapping his arms around him with a steady, reassuring grip. Ethan's face was streaked with tears, his small body trembling as adrenaline drained away. "You're safe now," Jack whispered, his voice low and firm. "It's over. He can't hurt you anymore." The boy clung tighter, burying his face against Jack's chest. "I'm not scared anymore," Ethan murmured, and for the first time, Jack believed him. The police secured the scene quickly. Officers swarmed the warehouse, photographing evidence, cataloging seized assets, and escorting survivors to safety. The three women Jack had found earlier were led out wrapped in blankets, their faces pale but relieved. One of them, a young Latina named Marisol Reyes, no older than 22, paused briefly as she passed Jack. Her once vibrant eyes were dulled by trauma, her long dark hair tangled and her thin frame hunched as if still trying to disappear. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely. Jack nodded. "You're free now. No one's ever going to own you again." Victor was hauled to his feet by two officers, his face twisted into a mask of hatred and humiliation. Even in defeat, he tried to regain control. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice hoarse but venomous. "I have men in every state. You can't stop what's coming." Jack stepped forward, his storm-gray eyes hard and unwavering. "Maybe not everywhere, but I stopped you here, and that's enough." Victor sneered, but said nothing more as he was shoved into the back of a waiting police vehicle, the door slamming shut with a satisfying thud. As dawn crept over Ironwood, the once bustling warehouse district was transformed into a massive crime scene. News vans gathered at the perimeter, their cameras catching every angle of Victor's downfall. Reporters shouted questions as officers carried out boxes of evidence. Jack ignored them all. His focus remained on Ethan, who now sat on the back bumper of an ambulance with Ranger pressed protectively against his side. A paramedic, a middle-aged man named Dr. Samuel Kent, with a neatly trimmed beard and weathered hands that spoke of decades in emergency care, examined the boy's injuries. "The arm will need a proper cast," Dr. Kent explained, "but he's stable, and considering what he's been through, remarkably strong." Ethan managed a faint smile. "Ranger saved me," he said softly, scratching the shepherd behind the ears. Ranger's tail thumped gently, his amber eyes watching Ethan closely, as if he understood every word. Jack knelt beside them, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You were brave too. Braver than most grown men I've met." Later, Jack was called over to speak with Agent Rebecca Nolan, a seasoned FBI field agent in her early 40s. Rebecca was tall and composed, with sharp green eyes that missed nothing and short auburn hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Her tailored navy suit and polished boots contrasted with the gritty chaos around her. Years of dismantling trafficking rings had given her a reputation for being relentless but deeply empathetic, a trait shaped by the loss of her younger sister to a similar network years ago. "We've already traced several shell companies and bank accounts tied to Carter's operation," she said, flipping through a thick folder of documents. "With what we found here, he's looking at life without parole. And not just him, half his network is about to come down with him." Jack exhaled slowly, the weight of months, years of darkness beginning to lift. "Good. He doesn't get to destroy any more lives." Rebecca glanced at Ethan, who was now sipping hot cocoa handed to him by a young officer. "What's going to happen to the boy?" she asked. Jack's expression softened. "I'm not sure yet. The state will have to decide, but I promised his mom I'd protect him, and I intend to keep that promise." The following days blurred together in a whirlwind of interviews, statements, and legal paperwork. Victor Carter's empire unraveled piece by piece as evidence piled up. Videos, financial ledgers, and testimony from survivors who were finally free to speak. Jack testified before federal prosecutors, laying out every detail from the night he found Ethan on that snowy road to the moment Victor was dragged out of his own warehouse in handcuffs. The trial would be long, but the case was airtight. Through it all, Ethan never left Jack's side. They shared meals at the substation. Ranger always curled nearby like a living shadow. Nights were the hardest. Ethan's nightmares were frequent and intense. Screams that woke the whole building, pleas for his mother, whispered apologies for things no child should ever have to feel guilty for. Jack never once left him to face them alone. He would sit beside the boy's bed, speaking softly until the nightmares faded. Ranger resting his head on Ethan's chest to calm his shaking. One evening, as they sat on the front steps of the substation watching the snow fall, Ethan spoke without looking up. "So, you think Mom would be proud of me?" Jack swallowed the lump in his throat. "She'd be more than proud, Ethan. She'd be amazed by your strength." The boy nodded slowly, clutching Ranger's collar. "I don't feel strong." Jack placed a hand on his shoulder. "Strength isn't about not being scared. It's about standing back up even when you are." A week after the raid, Rebecca Nolan returned with news. "The federal charges have been filed. Carter's bail was denied and—" She hesitated, a rare softness breaking through her usual professionalism. "Child Protective Services has finished their evaluation. They've reviewed everything. The trauma, the evidence, your bond with him." Jack's heart pounded. "And?" Rebecca smiled faintly. "They're recommending you for guardianship." The words hung in the air, heavier than any commendation or medal Jack had ever received. Ethan's head snapped up, eyes wide. "Does that mean—" Jack knelt in front of him, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means if you want, you can stay with me. With Ranger. We can be a family." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then, with tears glistening in his eyes, he threw his arms around Jack's neck. "I want that more than anything." As night fell over Ironwood once again, the town was quieter than it had been in months. Victor Carter was locked away, his empire in ashes. Survivors were beginning to heal, and Ethan, a boy who had once stumbled out of the snow with nothing but fear, was finally home. Jack stood by the station window, watching the snowfall catch in the lamplight. Ranger pressed against his leg, warm and steady. Behind him, Ethan slept soundly for the first time in years. The war was over. But for Jack Reynolds, for Ranger, and for Ethan Carter, a new chapter was just beginning. The courthouse in downtown Ironwood stood as a stoic monument to the law, a gray-stoned building with tall columns and weathered steps that had witnessed nearly a century of justice being served. On that cold winter morning, its halls buzzed with unusual tension. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointing skyward, while reporters braved the icy wind to capture every moment of the trial that had gripped the nation. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. This wasn't just another case. It was the reckoning of Victor Carter, the man whose name had become synonymous with greed, cruelty, and corruption. Jack Reynolds sat on a wooden bench near the front of the courtroom, wearing his formal sheriff's uniform for the first time in months. The dark navy fabric fit snugly across his broad shoulders, his gold badge catching the pale light streaming through the stained glass windows. Next to him, Ethan Carter fidgeted nervously with the hem of his sweater, his once fragile demeanor slowly transforming into something more resilient. The boy's small face still bore the traces of the trauma he'd endured. A faint scar on his wrist, tired eyes that had seen too much. But beneath it all was a quiet strength that Jack admired deeply. Ranger lay at their feet, his amber eyes scanning the room with calm vigilance, the loyal shepherd's presence grounding them both. The trial had lasted for weeks, and the evidence against Victor was overwhelming. Video recordings, financial documents, witness testimonies, each piece had meticulously stripped away the facade of respectability he had hidden behind for so long. Now, the end was near. Across the room, Victor sat at the defendant's table in an orange prison jumpsuit, his once impeccable appearance reduced to a shadow of itself. His slicked-back hair was now disheveled, his sharp features gaunt, and his trademark smirk replaced by a hollow glare. Yet, even now, arrogance lingered in his icy blue eyes, the stubborn defiance of a man who still believed himself untouchable. Presiding over the case was Judge Harold Whitmore, a man in his early 60s with a stern but fair presence. He was tall and slightly stooped from age, with silver hair combed neatly back and deep lines etched across his weathered face. Lines earned from decades of delivering justice in a town that often tried to outrun it. Known for his unwavering adherence to the law and his disdain for corruption, Whitmore was both respected and feared by those who stood before his bench. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. A hush fell over the room as Judge Whitmore entered, his black robes flowing behind him. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice steady and commanding, "you have been found guilty by a unanimous jury on multiple counts, including human trafficking, money laundering, first-degree murder, and aggravated child abuse. Do you have anything to say before sentencing is rendered?" Victor rose slowly, his shackled hands clinking softly. "This isn't justice," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "You think locking me away will change anything? Men like me will always exist. You can't stop the world from being what it is." The judge's gaze didn't waver. Perhaps, but we can stop you. He lifted the gavel slightly, his next words echoing through the chamber. For your crimes against the innocent, for the destruction you have wrought, and for the suffering you've caused, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment as Victor was led away, his curses drowned out by the sound of clinking chains. Ethan gripped Jack's hand tightly, his voice barely above a whisper. Is it really over? Jack looked down at him and smiled. Yes, buddy, it's over. But the trial wasn't the only matter to be decided. A week later, they returned to the courthouse for a different kind of hearing, one that would decide Ethan's future. The courtroom was smaller, more intimate. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with legal volumes, and a single flag hung behind the bench. It was here that Marjorie Hill, a child welfare officer in her 50s, presented her findings. Marjorie was a kind-eyed woman with soft gray curls and a calm, reassuring presence. Her work had taken her into countless homes over 3 decades, and the weight of those stories showed in the gentle patience with which she spoke. After thorough evaluation, she said, glancing up from her report, it is the recommendation of the state that Deputy Jack Reynolds be granted full guardianship of Ethan Carter. He has demonstrated exceptional commitment to the child's safety, emotional well-being, and long-term stability, supported by his service dog, Ranger. Judge Whitmore turned his gaze toward Ethan. Young man, do you understand what this means? Ethan nodded shyly. It means I can stay with Jack and Ranger. I can have a family again. The judge's stern features softened into a faint smile. Then so it shall be. His gavel struck the bench with a decisive thud. Guardianship is granted. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he turned to Jack. I get to stay? Jack knelt, his voice thick with emotion. You're not going anywhere, kid. You're home. Ranger barked softly as if sealing the promise. The weeks that followed marked a slow but beautiful transformation. Life in Ironwood began to return to normal, though the scars of the past lingered like faint shadows. Clara Jennings, the woman they had rescued from Victor's compound, had joined a local outreach program, helping other survivors rebuild their lives. Agent Rebecca Nolan continued coordinating with federal authorities, dismantling the remnants of Victor's criminal network, piece by piece. And Jack found himself navigating something he had never expected. Fatherhood. Mornings became their favorite part of the day. Ethan, now with his arm fully healed, would rush to get ready for school, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he bounded down the stairs. Ranger, ever the vigilant companion, followed closely behind, his tail wagging with excitement. Jack would pack lunches and remind Ethan to wear his gloves, all while pretending not to be amused by the boy's growing independence. The morning of Ethan's first day back at school was especially memorable. The winter sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered streets. Jack stood at the front gate of Ironwood Elementary, a modest red brick building that had stood since the 1950s, watching as Ethan adjusted his backpack straps. The boy turned back, his face bright with a mixture of nerves and excitement. Will you and Ranger be here when I'm done? Jack grinned. We wouldn't miss it for the world. As Ethan disappeared through the doors, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years, a deep, quiet peace. The battles were over. The monsters were gone. And for the first time in a long time, the future looked brighter than the past. Ranger nudged his hand, and Jack looked down at the loyal shepherd. We did good, boy, he murmured. Ranger barked once in agreement, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Life would never erase the pain of what Ethan had endured, but it had given them something far more powerful: a second chance. And as Jack watched the school doors close behind the boy who had once been lost and broken, he realized that family wasn't defined by blood. It was defined by the people and the dogs who chose to stand by you when the world tried to tear you apart. Even in the darkest storms, God never stops working. What happened to Ethan wasn't just justice. It was a reminder that miracles often come in unexpected forms: a brave officer, a loyal dog, and a second chance at life. In our everyday struggles, we might feel lost, broken, or forgotten. But God's love finds a way to reach us, often through people He places in our path. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about a miracle you've witnessed, and don't forget to subscribe. Together, let's keep spreading faith, kindness, and light. May God bless and protect you and your family.